Good afternoon. This is Charlie Zeiss with Only PVC Pyramids. Today's lecture is entitled Hiding in Plain Sight, the Interdimensional Geometry of the Russian Pyramids. I've been working on this for only about 6 weeks, but during the last 6 weeks, I have put together, through the help of a lot of people in the universe, some fascinating information which demonstrates that the Russian geometry pyramid, despite being new to those of us in contemporary society, has actually been around for thousands of years and shows up in many places that we would least expect it. So I'm really excited to be able to show you this information today. I wanted to give some thanks before we get started to a number of people who have acted to help me in getting this information together and out to you, the public. First, David Wilcock for getting me interested in Russian pyramids through his wisdom teaching series and books. And second, to Laura London. Laura London recently interviewed me on The Other Side of Midnight, which took place on June 30th. But I met Laura about a year ago in Chicago when she attended the Global Pyramid Conference. And I was new to this industry at the time, had just made my first pyramids and were displaying them at the conference. But Laura asked me probably the most important question that I didn't have an answer to at the time, which was basically, how come your pyramids create so much more energy than all the others? And really all I knew at the time was that these pyramids had great research behind them, but I honestly myself didn't know the sacred geometry of these pyramids. So her questions to me actually were those that prompted me to begin my quest initially for the sacred geometry of these Russian pyramids. And the next person I'd like to thank is Richard Hoagland, because even though he was not feeling well the night that Laura interviewed me, he called in with questions and asked me whether there were pyramids or other structures on the planet that I was aware of that had this geometry. And I had to tell him at that point, and again, this was June 30th, that I was not aware of it, but that I was going to start doing some research in that regard. Well, one thing led to another, and that's why we're here tonight. Another group to thank actually is the Pyramid Spiritual Societies movement. For those of you unfamiliar with the group, they are by far the largest organization devoted to pyramid meditation in the world. They have built over 25,000 pyramids throughout India, and now are moving into the countries around the world, building pyramids and teaching the value of pyramid meditation. Well, you can see me there in with that little hat, and we use this at our expos that we go to demonstrate the value of having a pyramid hat. I decided that I really wanted someday to make one in the geometry of the Russian pyramid, and that was the aha moment that really also began this lecture, because I started thinking about the Dunce Cap, which we're going to be talking about very shortly. Some other people who have contributed to this include Michael Hoynes, who's from Australia. He provided me the Egyptian hieroglyph that we're going to be seeing in this presentation from the Temple of Karnak. Marcus Bader, who actually created the MB Ruler app, protractor app that I use in this presentation as the basis for the research. Marshall Lefferts for his new book, Cosmometry, Exploring the Holofractal Nature of the Cosmos. Groundbreaking new book in this area of study. Patrick Koster from the Netherlands, who upon seeing the Egyptian hieroglyph in one of my videos, provided me the inspiration to look at the sacred geometry of the Indian temples. And finally, my significant other, who's been putting up with me in my research for the last several years. So anyway, with all those thanks done now, I want to get started with the presentation. The thesis of this discussion is that while the 76.345-degree geometry of the Russian pyramid may be new to many, this amazing geometry is actually quite prevalent throughout the world. Marshall Lefferts' new book, Cosmometry, Exploring the Holofractal Nature of the Cosmos, shows us examples of this very 76.345-degree geometry, which he calls the Phi Scaling Angle, as it naturally occurs in nature and throughout the universe. And after seeing Marshall's information, I started wondering how long ago mankind actually became aware of this knowledge and whether this knowledge has been previously used or discovered. And what I found out was that not only has mankind known of and used this geometry for thousands of years, but this geometry continues to be used throughout Western and Eastern culture. And furthermore, I've come to believe that this knowledge of this geometry has been actively suppressed. And the users of this geometry have been vilified and demonized, apparently in an attempt to hide this important and powerful information from the public, causing this geometry to literally be hidden in plain sight. So moving on, I've done an hour-long video on the early parts of this discussion, so I'm going to be breezing through this. If you'd like information on Russian pyramids above and beyond what we're going to do today, I would suggest that you go to my YouTube page and particularly look at the sacred geometry of Russian pyramids. It's about an hour-long video where I develop in much greater detail the sacred geometry that I discovered for the Russian pyramids. But Russian pyramids are the most thoroughly and scientifically researched pyramids on the planet. Moscow scientist and defense engineer Dr. Alexander Golod began building these pyramids within Russia and the Ukraine in 1990. Construction and research was funded and undertaken at the request of the Russian government, and the research was performed by teams of Russia's top military, medical, engineering, agricultural, and materials scientists. All Russian pyramids are built with non-metallic materials such as PVC pipe. As the research indicates, any metal in the pyramid structure causes its effects to be greatly reduced. And finally, although this information has not been made public by the Russians, we have demonstrated through our previous discussions and research that the pyramids in Russia are built with a slant angle of 76.345 degrees, corresponding exactly to the geometry of the Phi spiral and the Phi scaling angle. So here's the source material that I had to work with when I originally started making these pyramids. Dr. Golod's website, pyramids.ru, which is very difficult to find on a Western search engine. I guess we're not supposed to be able to know about this information, but it does indicate on the website that the height of the uncut pyramid to the base side is 2.02 to 1. And what they mean by the uncut pyramid top, there's actually not a capstone on these pyramids, so there's a section where at the very top of the pyramid where the pyramid does not come to a point, and that's the reason for their discussion of the uncut pyramid. Here's a visual review of the major pyramid geometries that we find today and that are discussed in the pyramid circles. The Giza Pyramid is the flattest at 51.82 degrees slant angle. The Golden Triangle or Pyramid has a slant angle of 72 degrees. The Nubian Pyramid has a slant angle of 72.8. And our pyramids, along with that of those made in Russia, have a slant angle of 76.345 degrees. And quickly to review, what is the golden ratio or phi? If you look at the diagram above, we'll see that A is to B as the sum of A plus B is to A. And what that ratio means or is in a numerical form is 1.618, and you can see it continues on ad infinitum. And that number is known as phi. Now, in summary, all major pyramid types other than the Russian pyramid, meaning the Giza, Nubian, and Golden pyramids, have at least one three-dimensional Phi ratio element in their geometry, as we will discuss on the next slide. Now, the Giza Pyramid, for a base dA of 1, you can see that the slant length, which is CA, is 1.618, which is equal to Phi, and its height, CD, is 1.272, which is the square root of Phi. So lots of Phi information and relationships in the Giza Pyramid. For the Golden Pyramid, which has for a base BA of 2 and an slant length of CA of 3.236, the ratio of that to a base length is 1.618 or Phi. So in the Golden Pyramid, we see that that ratio is in the slant height. In the Nubian Pyramid, it's the height itself, AD, of 3.236, which when divided by 2 gives you 1.618 or Phi. And then finally, here we have the Russian Pyramid. And as you can see, there are no clearly definable three-dimensional relationships with Phi. And that was what was throwing me off when Laura London asked me that question back at the Global Pyramid Conference, because up until that time, I didn't know what the sacred geometry of these pyramids was. But that question put me on to this research. And I'm going to go through briefly how I was able to decipher the geometry of the Russian pyramids. To review briefly, I've been doing a series on my YouTube channel called The Fundamentals of Pyramid Science, and I wanted to go through those quickly for you. 5 key elements. We need to know that there is an ether that exists. This has been a concept which has been in science basically since the beginning of time, with the exception of the 20th century in the West, when the concept of the ether was excised and taken out of our scientific knowledge base. But that theory has been alive and well in Russia, because they have used that information and that knowledge of the ether to prove the existence of torsion in scalar waves. The third step is the ability of objects, including pyramids, to act as passive torsion generators, which in plain English means to act as an energy generator of chi, prana, and life force energies. And then finally, the last two, the significance of Phi spirals and the Phi scaling angle in the creative process. We'll get into that today, and the existence of a multi-dimensional universe. Now, to review briefly some of the research that helped to lead me in the proper direction, Dan A. Davidson, about 30 years ago, wrote a classic book on this topic called Shape Power. And I'm quoting from a few sections from that book in our discussions about Phi spirals. One of the observations which many researchers have found is that ether prefers to move in circular arcs or spiral patterns. Dr. Wilhelm Reich found that orgone, Reich's name for the ether, moves in spiral patterns, and its constant motion is that of spirals. Victor Schauberger, in his groundbreaking research on diamagnetic energy, his name for the ether, also discovered that the diamagnetic energy moved in spiral and vortical patterns. If we apply this observation of the ether moving naturally in spiral and vortical patterns to shape power effects, then it is reasonable to infer that the use of curved or spiral pathways to mold and guide the ether will enhance its effects. And carrying along with that was some information that I subsequently read in David Wilcock's Divine Cosmos book, and this deals with the research of Dr. Anatole Akimov, a Russian torsion field physicist. Dr. Akimov, in the around 1990-91, produced some classic research which determined that the best passive torsion generators, or as we said earlier, life energy generators, were formed by cones that were shaped into the Phi ratio of 0.618 to 1. And in this context, and a lot of others, cones can be deemed and considered to be nothing more than a pyramid with an infinite number of sides. So this is highly relevant to our discussion. So what David tells us is that this information tells us that torsion waves are indeed Phi spirals, since a cone that duplicates this pattern will harness the waves most strongly. And this is, in fact, where I had my aha moment, because I realized there was no 3D dimension of Phi in the Russian pyramid geometry, but I wondered, wouldn't stacking a series of spheres on top of each other, whose diameters decreased by Phi, simulate the path of the Phi spiral? And what would be the geometry of a pyramid built around this series of stacked spheres? Well, here's a brief summary of my results. I took a series of spheres whose diameters were decreasing by Phi, or 1.618. The bottom sphere had a diameter of 1. The next one was divided by 1.618 to come up with a diameter of 0.618, which was again divided by Phi for 0.382, 0.236, and so forth up the pyramid. And when you do that and you build a triangle, in this case, around that series of spheres, you end up with a slant angle of 76.345 degrees, which is only 0.2 of a degree off from the original geometry that we saw for the Russian pyramid, and is easily justifiable by the dimensions of the walls that support the building. Now, what would a Phi spiral pyramid look like? We've done that in our logo now to demonstrate and to visualize for those of you, certainly most of you who are new to this concept, what a Phi spiral might look like. In this case, we have the torsion waves coming up from the bottom in a clockwise fashion. They begin to spiral in the geometry of the Phi spiral, as demonstrated by the series of spheres that they're going around. The spirals increase in their speed as you reach the top of the pyramid, and it's at the top of the pyramid where we have what I'm calling a vortex point of creation, essentially that creative point within the torus field that's been popularized by Nassim Haramein. So here's some interesting information regarding the Giza versus Russian pyramid geometry, and I think this is going to be quite valuable as we proceed on in our discussions today. I have depicted the two geometries in this GeoGebra diagram. The Russian pyramid is obviously the taller, and on the bottom of the page you can see the geometry of the Giza pyramid as well. So what I've done here is to look at the height ratio between the height of the Russian pyramid and the Giza pyramid, and when we do a ratio of those two, we find out that that ratio is 3.236, or 2 times 5. And similarly, when we look at the slant height of the Russian pyramid and look at the ratio of it to the slant height of the Giza pyramid, we end up with a ratio of 2.618, or Phi squared. And finally, when we look at the slant angle here at the bottom of the Russian pyramid, it's 76.345 degrees, and the apex angle of the Giza pyramid is exactly the same at 76.345 degrees. Certainly not a coincidence. So with that as background, I want to now start taking us into the visual side of the presentation. Several months ago, I found this information on cosmometry.net, which deals with cosmometry and the Phi Scaling Angle. This information is coming from Marshall Lefferts, and we'll be discussing him in a few moments. But in his words, cosmometry is an emerging field of knowledge and application that is the synthesis of millennia of observation, study, theory, and direct experience, scientifically and metaphysically, of the fundamental patterns, structures, processes, and principles of universal creation, be it through physics, music, bioenergetics, visionary art, shamanic journeys. A unified understanding of cosmic coherence is arising in consciousness at a new level of integration and wholeness. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with Marshall, he was the associate producer of the movie Thrive, which introduced me to the Taurus and Nassim Haramein about 12, 13 years ago. Up until recently, when his new book's published, and we'll talk about that in just a second, he was president of the board of directors of the Resonance Project Foundation, which is the research foundation of Nassim Haramein. He's the co-creator and faculty of the Resonance Academy, and also worked at the Buckminster Fuller Institute. And Marshall has just released a groundbreaking book on this topic, which goes into the Phi Scaling Angle in greater detail than the information that I'm providing today from his website. And that's called Cosmometry, Exploring the Holofractal Nature of the Cosmos. I've limited myself to you, and here's a copy of the cover of his brand new book. I would suggest that all of you go out and get it. It's got a lot of fascinating information in it. I'm limiting myself because I haven't asked Marshall whether it was okay to use information from his book. I have gotten information or the ability from him and permission to use the information from cosmometry.net. So that's what I'm limiting myself to in this presentation. But here's moving on some information on Phi spirals from the Cosmometry website. And Marshall here states that given how common it is, the Phi ratio seems to be perhaps the most fundamental scaling ratio in the manifest universe. It appears that nature has an innate tendency to scale biological growth, spiral arcs, atomic and galactic structures, and all manner of structural and flow forms upon the Phi ratio due to its optimal efficiency for exactly this need, scaling from micro to macro as harmoniously and seamlessly as possible. This indicates that the cosmic space-time field itself is inherently based upon this ratio as pertains to the manifest universe, whether expressed as a spiral, a structural proportion, an angle, or a quantity. The same ratio is at play throughout. And in the website, Marshall gives examples here, for example, of Phi spiral in the universe, in the galaxy. Here's a Phi spiral at work in a hurricane. But here's perhaps the most important parts of the website information that pertains to our discussion today, and that's the Phi scaling angle. And here Marshall says, and this is going to sound familiar, Phi is the angle of expansion or scaling angle that is inherent in Phi fractal scaling, where a set of circles or spheres with diameters expanding by Phi are placed tangential to one another in a straight line. The angle between the horizontal line at the bottom of each circle and the line that touches each circle's upper surface point is the Phi scaling angle. Now I'm going to show you that picture here in a minute, but Marshall goes on to say that this angle is approximately 27.5 degrees. Now, the top or apex angle of our pyramid from Russia is actually 27.309. So when I saw the approximate 27.5, I had to get in touch with Marshall. And in fact, Marshall later confirmed to me via email that this angle is in fact 27.309 degrees, precisely the apex angle of the Russian pyramid. So here's Marshall's depiction of what he's done. As you can see, he just put his pyramid on its side and was doing his calculations just from a different perspective. But on the right-hand side of the page where you see 27.5 degrees, that's essentially the apex angle which we've subsequently determined with Marshall is exactly 27.309 degrees, or the angle of the apex of the Russian pyramid. Now here's some examples that Marshall gives of the Phi scaling angle in nature. Here's one of a tree. Here's one of birds in flight. Here's one of sand at low tide at the beach. Here's one of the bark of trees. And finally one of a seashell exhibiting this geometry as well. So all great examples, but that took me to a whole new level of desire to learn more. And having been amazed at the numerous examples in nature, I decided to set about to see if I could find man-made examples of this geometry. And I soon became overwhelmed with the breadth of examples, which include the following, and I'm sure more as I find more examples as time goes on. Historical memes whose traditional meanings have become distorted and ridiculed to hide the significance of this geometry. Religious buildings, contemporary architecture, even DNA itself, contemporary government buildings, pyramids, temples, and hieroglyphs. And each of the examples that I'm going to show you on the following pages have been measured using an online protractor app called the MB Ruler. You can all get this, works on Google Chrome, and you can actually do this research yourself. And you'll, within the degree of precision that's actually achievable, and it is limited by pixelation and the quality of the photograph that you're able to blow up to do these measurements. But within that level of precision, each of the examples that we're showing on the following pages matches the 76.345 degree geometry of the Russian pyramids. So here we go. Here for first a couple of test examples of things that we know. We know that the slant angle of the of the Giza Pyramid is 51.82 degrees. We're getting 51.81 with the app, which is 1/10 of a degree off. That may have something to do actually with the exterior face of the Giza Pyramid itself, as it's become eroded and defaced over time. But we've tested it as well against the pyramid that was built outside of Moscow, and we achieve a reading of 76.34. Again, the MB ruler only goes to 2 significant digits, and the geometry of the Russian pyramid is supposed to be 76.345. So within the level of accuracy that we can get with this, it's right on the mark. And finally, we tested one of our own variations, our own pyramids, and it came out at 76.35 degrees. So using those as examples, we know that we can achieve the precision required within a very, very small margin of error. So now I want to move into my first example, which is the Dunce Cap. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Dunce Cap, I've given a brief definition. It's a conical cap formerly used as a punishment for slow learners at school. And I know that we learned about the Dunce Cap when I was in school. I think knowledge of that among the younger generations is falling off, but I wanted to give you that as background. Now I want to talk briefly about a brief history of the Dunce Cap, and you'll start to see what's going on here. John Duns Scotus was a 13th century Franciscan monk, philosopher, and theologian of great repute. Along with Thomas Aquinas and William of Ockham, he was one of the leading scholastic philosopher theologians of the High Middle Ages. He wrote treatises on theology, grammar, and logic, which were widely influential throughout Western Europe. Scotus developed a theory of a metaphysical God as opposed to the anthropomorphic model popular at the time. As part of his metaphysical view of God, Scotus advocated the use of pointed hats as a method of enlightenment and inspiration. The design of these hats was based upon the hats of the wizards of the era. Detractors of Scotus made fun of the cap, perhaps as a way to denigrate his belief in a metaphysical God. Over time, the dunce's cap came to be associated with stupid children or someone who was slow at learning, and was eventually misunderstood and used to stigmatize and make fun of such children. The heyday of the dunce cap seems to have been during the Victorian era, when use of the dunce cap as a disciplinary symbol took off in Europe and America. Thus, this symbol took on a meaning which hides the true historical significance of these hats, their unique geometry, and their historical role in spiritual development. Dunces, wizards, saints, and yogis all originally knew the importance of focusing on a point above the crown of the head in order to enhance their ability to concentrate and be fully aware. This point has been well known for many years. It is depicted as a halo in pictures of Christian saints. Yogis know it as the Eighth Chakra, which gives access to universal wisdom, and witches and wizards who wore a hat with a point in order to enhance their powers. And now for my first question of this, what do you think the geometry of the dunce cap might happen to be? Well, of course, it's 76.345 degrees. And I know that this is a modern depiction of the dunce cap. This is actually something that's for sale on Amazon, but I will show you now some historical picture of the dunce cap, which has the same identical geometry. And this comes from a medieval drawing of the dunce cap. This geometry is seen in a variety of different memes in Western culture now, including witches' hats. Here's the geometry of the hat worn by the Wicked Witch of the West in The Wizard of Oz, 76.36 degrees. Here we find it in the series Bewitched, and more recently in Sabrina the Teenage Witch, all wearing a hat with the geometry, the sacred geometry of the Russian pyramid and the Phi Spiral and Phi Scaling Angle. For those of you old enough to remember the cone heads, this was a comedy skit routine that was done in the early days of Saturday Night Live. Again, the cone head seems to approximate almost exactly the geometry of the Russian pyramid and the Phi Scaling Angle. Here's a ghost hat that I found a picture on Bing.com, which matches precisely. Here's a witch hat that's available on Party City's website, again matching within the margin of error. A gnome hat available on Amazon. And here's Mickey Mouse in the classic movie Fantasia, where he's playing the Sorcerer's Apprentice. His hat has an angle of 76.33 degrees. And here's a hat that you can buy today for your children or grandchildren, a sorcerer's Mickey Mouse hat, which is exactly the geometry of the Russian pyramids. Here's a Party City birthday hat, a New Year's Eve hat, and here's a megaphone. Now, what's fascinating to me is to find that the megaphone, again, this is something that some of the younger generation may not be aware of, but before we had the electronic versions of megaphones, we used devices such as these at football games, if you were a cheerleader, to shout out to the audience. And they have the exact geometry of the Russian pyramids and the Phi Scaling Angle. It would be interesting to me to talk to an audio engineer to find out whether, in fact, this is an optimal geometry as well for audio scaling and magnification, as it seems to be in nature as the Phi Scaling Angle. Here's another Party City megaphone with the same geometry. Now here's some medieval headwear. Women in medieval times wore pointed hats, at least the royalty did, as a matter of course. And here we see a medieval woman wearing a hat with a geometry of 76.32 degrees. Another here at 76.38. Here's another 76.36, 76.35, 76.35. So it was obvious that this geometry was well known and used extensively by women in medieval times, especially within royalty. Here's even a contemporary children's medieval costume hat, which has exactly the same geometry. Now this is a tontour. I don't know a lot about it, but this is a headdress that was popular in the Middle East, I believe, at around the 19th century. And it has, it looks like an angle, which again is spot on with the geometry of the Russian pyramids. And of course, we're going to be getting to this more later, but Hindu headwear. Here's one at 76.31 degrees and 76.33 degrees. Now we're going to move away from headwear and look at some examples of in architecture. Here we have a picture of Corvin Castle in Romania. This particular castle has a conical dome on it, which has the slant angle of 76.345 degrees. Here's a church steeple from the United States, 76.36 degrees. Another church steeple in the US. Here's a church steeple in Germany with the exact geometry. Now here's an interesting one, the Christmas tree. The Christmas tree virtually mimics perfectly the geometry of the Phi Scaling Angle in the Russian pyramid. Now, I don't think that it's an accident that the Christmas tree, as a so-called pagan tradition, was brought in to the Christian religion and has a geometry that demonstrates as that of the Phi Scaling Angle. So next time you think about your Christmas tree, think about the interdimensionality of that tree and what that represents. Now here's a synagogue in Tehran with the geometry as well. Now we're going to move on to some other objects. Here's the Chrysler Building, contemporary architecture, which demonstrates the slant angle. And interestingly enough, Tesla Motors, the slant angle of this geometry is again exactly right. If you're not seeing the pyramid, all you have to do is turn the logo upside down and you'll see it. Now here's another interesting demonstration hiding in plain sight. This is the George Washington National Masonic Memorial in Washington, D.C. Now if you look up at the top, you're going to see a pyramidal shaped top of that dome. And when we go to measure it, lo and behold, 76.35 degrees. And now one that to me is perhaps the most profound for all of us is the fact that it looks as though the spiral of DNA may in fact match the geometry of the Phi Scaling Angle in the Russian pyramid. I would love to have someone who has more sophisticated equipment be able to help me, because I think this could be the most profound of all of the studies that we're doing here, if there is a correlation between DNA and the geometry of the Phi spiral. But here's another example of a sailboat sail matching the Phi Scaling Angle. Here's a whirlpool of water. And now moving on to Japan, you see these rock Zen pyramids everywhere. And of course, I've seen them in the US as well. This particular one has a slant angle, excuse me, of 76.4 degrees. Here's another one that's much closer, 76.35 degrees. And to show that these aren't accidents, I found this picture of a contemporary Japanese pyramid house where the geometry of this door is 76.33 degrees. Again, very, very close to the Phi Scaling Angle. Here's a piece of Turkish headgear, 76.33 degrees. And now moving on to some contemporary architecture and government buildings. This is the inside of a government building. We'll tell you what it is in a moment. But it has in the back of its podium area a triangle with a slant angle of 76.33 degrees. Yes, it's the Iranian Parliament building. Here's another example of a pyramid that matches the geometry. This was built around 1810 on a manual head. It's called the Emmanuel Head Pyramid on Holy Island in the United Kingdom. Now, I find it fascinating that it was built in 1810. Perhaps this information was being received through the colonization of India at the time, which we're going to get to in a moment. But I find that a pyramid of this geometry in that era is fascinating, is something that I want to do more research on. About a month ago, I interviewed a young man from Australia named Michael Hoynes, and he was developing ormus with this geometry pyramid. And when I asked him during the interview how he came about it, he sent me this hieroglyph, which comes from the Temple of Karnak. And as you'll see, there's a pyramid at the top right-hand corner of the hieroglyph, and we'll see the geometry here in a minute. But this is part of a hieroglyph which, when translated, I had this translated by a channel that I have great faith in. And the first line means power of breath. The second line, enlightenment manifesting. And then this symbol at the bottom means lifetime. So sure enough, when you look at this particular symbol shows up in a number of places actually in hieroglyphs, but this particular photo was the easiest and best for defining the geometry, and so I used it. And I got 76.35 degrees, spot on with the 76.345 within the margin of accuracy of the protractor app we're using. And now I found this information on Queen Nefertiti. Someone recreated her face. And when you look at the headgear above her head, you can see that it closely approximates that of the Phi Scaling Angle, as does this depiction of similar Egyptian headwear. Now moving on to what I think is the most fascinating information that I've come across to date. And again, I'm thankful for the contact from the Netherlands who inspired me to look at this information. And it's the clarity of the dimensions on these pyramids demonstrates very, very clearly that the ancient builders of these Hindu temples knew of the Phi Scaling Angle. And this is the first of many that I'll be showing you today. We're going to study a number of temple complexes. The first one is based in Thiruvannamalai, India, and it is called the Annamalayar Temple. I apologize if I don't speak the language, if I mispronounce these. But this is an aerial view of the temple complex. And now that your mind is now attuned to looking for the 76.345 degree angle, you can see that it's hiding in plain sight in this temple complex. This temple complex is dedicated to the deity Shiva, and Shiva is the Lord of divine energy, meditation, and yoga, and is one of the principal deities of Hinduism. Now before we go into the temples themselves, I wanted to show you a statue of Shiva, and as we come in closer, we look at the slant angle at the top of Shiva's head, and we can see that we've got the same geometry here at work of 76.345 degrees. Here's a picture of Shiva with a headgear on, and we receive a similar result of 76.31 degrees, and another at 76.4. But now moving on to the temples themselves, I'm going to show you a number of photographs from different angles taken at different eras, different cameras, so that you'll see that no matter which photograph, which angle, which direction these photos are coming from, I'm getting a consistent reading that all of these pyramids within this complex have the 76.345 degree geometry. So here's the main pyramid within the complex, 7635. Here's another picture of that pyramid taken a number of years ago, 7633. Here's some pictures of the same temple with lights on, 7633. And then we're looking at some of the smaller pyramids now, 7633, 7636. Even the side angle of the pyramids that are facing, this is actually a side angle of one of the smaller pyramids. You can see that even that geometry is that of the Phi Scaling Angle. And one more, again, of a larger pyramid, side angle view, 76.34. Now we're going to move on to the Raghunath Swami temple complex in Srirangam, India. This temple complex is dedicated to Ranganatha, a reclining form of the deity Vishnu. This is the world's largest functioning Hindu temple, and this temple complex is at least 2,000 years old. It's dedicated to Vishnu, one of the three main deities in Hinduism, and Vishnu is known as the protector. Here's a statue of Vishnu, the preserver, and once again we measure the headwear, and what do we find but the 76.345 degree angle. Here's some pictures of the temple, and what is interesting of note here is that the geometry seems to hold on this interior part of the temple, which actually forms the shape of a pyramid. And it shows up as 76.36 degrees in this photo, 7634, 7637, and here's some other temples. Measuring the outside of these temples, we get the 76.345 degree geometry. Here's one more picture of the Srirangam main pyramid showing the angle of the Phi spiral, and another. Here's some older pictures of some of the smaller pyramids in the complex. Again, 7635, 7637, 7633. So you can see that the Srirangam pyramid complex is filled with this geometry in all of the temples that show up in the complex. Next, we're going to look at the Brahmapuraswarar temple in Tirupattur, India. This is one of the few temples dedicated to Brahma, the third deity in Hinduism. Brahma is the creator god. Here's a statue of Brahma, the creator. Once again, seeing the geometry in the headgear worn by Brahma. And here, once again, the outside geometry of these temples, the 76.35 degree angle, 7634 from another perspective. And here is a picture of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, all in one drawing, all wearing similar headgear, which has the 76, in this case, 76.4 degree slant angle to the headgear or headwear of these three deities. Another temple complex is the Minashi Temple in Midori, India. This one is dedicated to Parvati, known as Minashi, and her consort Shiva. And this temple forms the heart and lifeline of the 2,500-year-old city of Midori. And it is said that this temple was originally built in the 6th century BC. Here's a picture of Minashi. And once again, we'll measure her headwear and we'll see that there seems to be a correlation here with the angle of the headwear. But it's clear within the exterior geometry that each of these temples has the slant angle of the Russian pyramids and the Phi Scaling Angle. Here we have 7634, another picture, 7633, 7636, 7635, and even the sides again of this complex, 7634. Here's a Minashi temple that was built in Houston. I grew up there, and I know that this temple was not there when I was a child, so this is of fairly recent vintage. And sure enough, they have replicated the temples from India with precision with a 76.35 degree slant angle. Here's another temple, the Shore Temple in Mahabalipuram, India. And here's the Ramanshah Temple in India, 7634, 7636. So we could go on, but the big question that obviously now comes to mind is, with all of this information from both East and West, contemporary and antiquity, why is it that we have not known about this before? Well, I don't think it even takes a 76.34 degree thinking cap to come up with the right answer. And although the geometry of the Giza Pyramid is the more readily recognized on a conscious level, the geometry of the Russian pyramid, Phi Spiral, Phi Scaling Angle, ancient Hindu temples is hiding in plain sight. The significance of this geometry is demonstrated through Egyptian hieroglyphs, the enormous number of ancient Hindu temples incorporating this geometry, the headwear of Hindu deities, Western medieval aristocracy, witches, wizards, and clergy, and through contemporary architecture, logos, and memes, and I left out, and even DNA itself. This substantial history of spiritual, esoteric, and religious use of this geometry demonstrates the tremendous significance, albeit suppressed, of this geometric angle in enhancing our physical and spiritual well-being. I would be interested in getting feedback from each and every one of you now that you've seen this, particularly now that you're attuned to it, as you see greater examples of this geometry. I would appreciate if you'd forward those on to me. This may at some point become a book, because I think this is information that needs to get out in a major way. This geometry is all around us. It is interdimensional, it is hyperdimensional, and it has tremendous healing and spiritual benefits for each and every one of us, as demonstrated by the information that I've shown you today. So this information has been known by the secret societies. If we look at the Masonic Temple in Washington, D.C., the Hindu temples throughout India, this information has been known by people for thousands of years, but it's been hidden from us, but yet it is hiding in plain sight. So I hope this has been interesting and educational for each and every one of you. Please contact me with any comments, and I thank you for watching, and you have a great day.